At the start of the show, I accept it's not a huge, cheery subject to start my Friday evening show with. However, I deliberately chose to do that because I think that suicide awareness, conversations around suicide, I think they are incredibly important. And there's a big national day on the 10th of September as well, where there's a lot of focus on this, but I'm off that day. So I thought, well, I'm going to do it tonight instead. We talk a lot, don't we, about depression, and we talk a lot about mental health. But I do think, personally, when it comes to the specific topic of suicide, I think that there is still a lot of stigma around it. And often what happens is people then don't talk out, and then it's too late. And then what happens is then you have a conversation where you find out that someone's passed away, and you sit and you say, well, you had no idea. Just to put some context onto this as well, some figures back from 2019 said that 6,524 Brits died from suicide. Joining me now, Nick Rothwell. Good evening. This is a subject that's affected you, hasn't it? Tell me more.
Yeah, Michelle, thanks for having me on. It did affect me in the way that, you know, I'm 50 years old, so I'm in the demographic.
Very well.
Thank you. That's because when I was 45, I was living, you wouldn't have recognized me, I was living kind of in a squat in Toronto that would have resembled something from Trainspotting. And I was dying of alcoholism, and I didn't care or if I lived or died. It was the solution that I once found in alcohol no longer worked. And I also grew up in this environment where I was taught that real men never cry, real men don't ask for help, and real men can sort out all their own problems. You know, my father was from Doncaster, and he was the son of a coal miner and a rugby player. So, you know, he gave me those masculine traits that almost killed me, because I knew I had a problem for 15 years, but I still wasn't able to reach out for help. And living in this kind of quagmire of, you mentioned in the beginning of the show about the cloud, I was in a quagmire of just darkness. And, you know, the pain of what my body was going through, I can't describe. I'd actually, you know, I led a life that you would thought, this guy's never going to end up in jail, but yet, you know, the consequences of my drinking ended up in jail. And I would have thought that would have been the most painful.
You did end up in jail?
Yeah. You know, with murders and rapists and drug dealers. And I was sitting and I would have thought that would have been the darkest point of my life. But the actual darkest point was, you know, sitting in rooms, seeing people become better when I still couldn't. And it led me into this place where I just didn't care if I lived or died. And I knew that at that time, just over 5 years ago, acute pancreatitis, liver failure, and kidney failure, and in the hospital probably every few days, where the doctors were like, Nick, dude, you're going to die, you know, another drink. But yet I would still leave and turn to the bottle because it was the solution that I had, but that I said no longer worked.
So then what happened? Because you're here, you look very well. You've lived to tell a tale. So how did you go from there to where you are now?
So, as I mentioned, you know, I was taught that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But I think it was, you know, when you're beaten so much, kind of like, you know, Rocky keeps getting up, right? And I think it was a point where, I'm not saying I'm Rocky, but it was a point where I tapped out. And I was just like, I'm done. And it was like a physical and mental and spiritual just broke. Like, part of Nick died. And I ended up getting sober in a 12-step program, and I went to one of those meetings, and, you know, a person who I looked at, he was a similar age to me, he was, you know, and had similar experiences, and I just said those two words that saved my life, and I meant it, and I said, help me.
Did you?
Yeah.
And I think, I know the meetings that you're referring to, and I know the feeling of thinking that I might need to go, but then actually taking that first step. It's all about that first step, isn't it? Acknowledging, and that's what I was trying to get across in my intro, just that acknowledgement that actually, maybe I am ill, maybe what my brain is telling me to do this, to do this, to do this, maybe that's a sign of an illness, maybe there is a different way. And I think that first step, and what I want to know from you, I guess, Nick, is, you know, you talk about you recognise that you're wanting to get help and everything, but how did you physically take that? I don't mean how did you walk. I mean, how did you physically take that step and make yourself go to that meeting?
I'd been going to the meetings many times before for about 1.5 years. And as I mentioned, that was probably the worst time in my life, was I was seeing other people get better. And you kind of like have one foot in recovery and one foot in self-will and ego, and I can still sort this out. And this, yeah, but you don't understand me. And it was when, I think, when you see enough people where you see some similarity in your story, and you start to have some faith, and then you start to have some trust. And I think it was this kind of thing of like, you know, believing that something could change by seeing enough evidence. That's why I think something like this is so important, because ultimately what we want to try to do is give people hope.
Indeed. Indeed, and on that subject, just pause for thought there, because also joining me now, we've got Rebecca Jane, who is the CEO of RJ8, which is a private mental health clinic. Rebecca, good evening to you. Tell me briefly, if you will, your story.
Wow, gosh. So my story with mental illness has been going on for 18 years, on and off. And it wasn't probably until about 3 years ago that I got sufficient help to declare myself mentally well enough. However, I absolutely appreciate that mental illness is always a part of my life that will come and go. It's spotting the signs, recognising it and dealing with it when it turns up is the only thing that I can pretty much do. But I'm in a good place right now.
And what would you say, because one of the things that I feel very strongly about, I lived for years not wanting to be here, and I don't mean that flippantly. I don't mean like, oh, every now and again I'd have a bad day. I mean, it was a constant imposter in my life. These thoughts were constant imposition in my life, almost wherever and whatever I was doing. And I guess what I'm trying to help people to realise is that if you're in that position, it feels so real. It feels like no one will understand, you know, nothing can get better. That is potentially one of your only options. And I want to try and make people realise that that's not a well mind. Well minds don't think like that, do they? And there can be, I mean, look, I'm sitting here now and I genuinely, you know, I feel very privileged and blessed to be so. And I want to get from you, if I can, some advice. So if people are watching this, NHS, you know, that I'm saying to people, go and ask for help. And people will push back to me and say, well, go where? Go where? Do what? The NHS? I think it's a joke, actually, when it comes to mental health, particularly in accessing talking therapy. So what do people do, Rebecca?
Listen, this is a really, really difficult topic. And what I would say is that you touched on it before about hope. And hope for me is the best gift that you can give anybody with mental illness. First, biggest problem that we've all got when we're in that stage is that we actually don't even realise that we're in that stage. So trying to recognise the signs within yourself. Second of all, for me, there are three organisations that should be responsible for mental health. One, we all need to be responsible for our own mental health and helping ourselves. Two is the NHS, because that is the national body that is here to help us when we're unwell, and a broken mind is no different than a broken leg. The third one is actually businesses and organisations. So I set up RJ8 and do what I do because I was once that person who couldn't get help. The NHS is overwhelmed. It is what it is. Unfortunately, that's the path that we've got to deal with, and we need to navigate around it. So for me, that's where businesses and companies come in. So I very much specifically put policies and procedures in place, and I give unlimited all year round counselling to all employees that sign up to our programme. The cost of which starts at £15 per person for the year. So a business has a duty of care legally to look after all of their employees. If every business signed up to that, there probably wouldn't be a mental health crisis in the UK. There's not just my company, there's various ones that do this kind of service. But then it would take those people off the NHS waiting list. And essentially, the NHS would be left for the people who do genuinely have nowhere else to ask for help. Because when you've made that decision and when you've actually reached out and asked for help, the last thing that you need to be doing is going through a 6 to 9 month waiting list. You need help there and then. And businesses in this country can take responsibility for that.
Isabel, I just want to bring you in here because I know that this is a subject, and I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but I know this has impacted your family as well, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think a key issue here, you talked about making that step to say, I need help, but this is not my personal experience, but within my family, very close person to me, desperately needed help, and frankly it just wasn't there. And you know, as your previous interviewee was saying, it's no good to be told you may be able to go into rehab in 3 months' time if you're good and you fulfill this, that and the other. I mean, people who are in a suicidal or addiction downward spiral, they're not able to fit into some tick box thing. I remember calling NHS 111 because somebody close to me was actually threatening to harm themselves with a knife. They were wielding that knife, and I was there, and I didn't know what to do. I called NHS 111. I explained the situation. This person desperately needs help. They wouldn't talk to me. They wanted to speak to the patient themselves. Well, the patient themselves was extremely unwell and wielding a knife. You know, that kind of tick box attitude to mental health just doesn't work for the reality of it. And I do worry. I think we've got a massive problem stacking up here in terms of resourcing for mental health. It is something that the government, the Department of Health, has prioritised. Extra resources were put in pre-pandemic. But the statistics now, the figures of the people, number of people that now need help as a result of the impact of a succession of lockdowns and the loneliness and the anxiety and the fear culture that we've lived with for the last 18 months is devastating. And it's fortunate and extraordinary, actually, that suicide figures over the pandemic have not gone up in the way you might expect. But please don't imagine that this problem has gone away. I think addiction and your experience is inspiring. I'm so glad that you got better. But there are a lot of people who are still living with this and they don't know where to get help. Yeah, and Benedict as well. This whole kind of, we talk about men, and like I just said, it's the biggest killer of men under the age of 45. And I do still think that there is this pressure, and Nick alluded to it then, there is still this pressure that a man needs to be a man, and like you're hard and you don't cry and you're the strong front. And I just wondered your view on that.
The thing that always strikes me about all of these discussions is that it always comes back to there needs to be more money for the NHS, or there needs to be better mechanisms for the NHS to function. And that, I think, is a symptom, actually, of a very unwell society, that everything is always focused on the cure rather than prevention. And actually, we see this across a broad range of factors. I mean, we were talking earlier in the show, weren't we, about social care and, caring for people with dementia or other sort of underlying health conditions. And that is just going to get bigger and bigger, actually, because people fundamentally aren't living necessarily their healthiest lifestyles, and that's both in terms of actually sort of their physical health, but also mental health. And I think a lot of that is because we've discussed all sorts of very complex and difficult issues during the course of the show that, 100 years ago, people would never have actually, conceived of. Are we actually, setting people up from a very young age mentally to deal with these things, to learn, healthy coping mechanisms? Or are they just sort of being left to fend for themselves? And I do think part of the strategy is actually prevention, rather than just giving more money to the NHS or, reforming the NHS. It has to be about looking at building young adults who can actually withstand a lot of the pressures of modern life and who actually know where to seek out help, rather than turn to very unhealthy coping mechanisms. I think that's a really important part of the cure. Yeah. And Rebecca, I mean, my guest here, Benedict, had just mentioned about, this kind of continuum of kind of, I think you almost need a toolbox. That's the way I've got myself well, and I try and stay well, is to create a toolbox for myself, when I'm having a down day. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that kind of thing is, ways that you can try and help yourself as well on an ongoing basis.
I think it's really difficult, and obviously every individual needs different tactics. And for me, the NHS doesn't offer enough. And I say that as somebody that's delivered an NHS service. So I think that there are so many different modalities of therapy that are really good out there. And it's about finding the right one for you. It's also about finding the right therapist, if I'm being brutally honest. There is a lot of responsibility that needs to be taken by the individual, and the willingness to enter into therapy services. The one thing that I do just want to say is that there's been a little bit of pickup on the statistics side. And I think that you're a really good person to look into this and voice it, because I don't believe that the statistics are right. I'm somebody that triaged over 200 people a month since December last year. And I can say that I saw a 566% increase on people that were suicidal with our patients. And I can also tell you that 52% of people feel that they would be better off dead or more than half of the days in the week. I don't believe that the statistics that are coming out at the moment are actually accurate. And I think that they need a little bit more review and an actual honesty.
Rebecca, thank you very much for your thoughts. And I've got to say, I saw some suicide stats from one of the earlier portions of lockdown, celebrating how they've not risen, and in fact they're in the decline. And I've got to say, my initial instinct to that was, it doesn't stack up, does it? No, I don't. It doesn't. It feels odd to me. Nick, very briefly, the final word to you on this topic.
There was no way up until I got to that point that I was going to ask for help. For 15 years, I had opportunities to ask for help, but I didn't mean it. So we're always asking people to reach out and to say something to ask for help when really the majority of people won't. So what I say to people is, and you said it at the top of your show, it's the people who we least expected. So as someone who is in the recovery community and I have a lot of people around me, I consciously make an effort to reach out to people. The people who are like, hey, I'm really good today. You know, so if people are thinking about things and tools that they can do to help, and maybe to I can't say that we can ever stop somebody from taking their own lives, but to check in with people, because we always say reach out for help. It's good to talk. But when you're in the crux of your illness, you're never going to talk. You know, I certainly wasn't. So reach out to people. Have a list of people and reach out to them. Indeed. And thank you as well for, I mean, this is a very challenging story to cover, isn't it, and topic to cover. If you've been affected, of course, by any of these topics, just flash up there on the screen some places that you can contact for help. Samaritans, of course.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.